The sky wasn't supposed to burn like that. For 3 weeks, we stared at a dead horizon, choking on the stench of our own casualties, waiting for a galactic council fleet that was never coming. We were written off. A rounding error in a border war nobody cared about. But the universe has a funny way of answering desperate bleeding prayers. When the sky finally tore open, it wasn't the pristine silver ships of the council. It was Earth. The trench smelled like copper and voided bowels. Cole dug his fingers into the clay, his fingernails caked with thick gray mud that had long since stopped feeling cold. It was just a numb weight, now pulling at his sleeves, dragging him deeper into the earth. He didn't feel brave. He felt nauseous. The rations he'd forced down 12 hours ago, some synthetic oat composite that tasted like damp cardboard, sat heavy and acidic at the back of his throat. He swallowed hard, trying to keep it down. If he threw up now, the acid would ruin the seal on his rebreather, and the ambient sulfur in the air would finish him off long before the enemy did. To his left, Miller was praying. Not loudly, just a frantic, breathy whisper that barely carried over the steady drumming of the acid rain against their Kevlar plating. Cole hated the sound. It was the sound of a man who had already accepted he was dead, but was trying to negotiate the terms of his afterlife. "Shut up, Miller," Cole rasped. His throat felt lined with sandpaper. Miller didn't stop. He just rocked back and forth, his knees tucked into his chest, clutching a dented kinetic rifle like it was a stuffed animal. Further down the line, Sergeant Radek sat on an overturned ammunition crate, staring at a cracked data pad. The screen flickered, casting a sickly blue glow over his exhausted face. Radek's left eye was swollen shut from shrapnel graze 2 days prior, the surrounding flesh an ugly mottled purple. "Any word from the relay?" Cole asked, though he already knew the answer. Radek didn't look up. "Static. Same as it's been since Tuesday. They're not coming," Cole said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a lament. It was just a dull, heavy fact. The Galactic Council had drawn a line in the sand, and the colony of Oakhaven happened to fall on the wrong side of it. The insectoid hive mind known as the Vexen wanted the sector. The Council, in their infinite cowardly wisdom, had decided a backwater agricultural hub wasn't worth a full-scale mobilization. They had left the planetary militia to hold the line. 3,000 farmers' mechanics and logistics clerks against a swarm that consumed entire continents. Cole leaned his head back against the dirt wall of the trench. The vibrations were starting again. Faint at first, a slight tremble in the base of his spine, slowly moving up through his ribs. It was the heavy siege armor of the Vexen. They were moving into position. He looked at his own hands. They were shaking. He hated that. He wanted to be the stoic veteran you saw in the propaganda vids, the guy who lit a cigarette and smiled grimly in the face of annihilation. Instead, he was just a 32-year-old hydroponics engineer who missed the smell of real coffee and desperately wanted to go to sleep. The rain picked up, turning the bottom of the trench into a sluggish brown river. A rat-fat and oblivious scurried over Cole's boot. He didn't even flinch. "Check your power packs." Radek's voice drifted down the line. It lacked the commanding bark of a military leader. It was just tired. "They're shifting their artillery. We have maybe 20 minutes before the vanguard hits the wire." Cole fumbled with his rifle. The metal was slick with rain and grease. He popped the battery cell 60%, enough to kill maybe 30 of them if his aim held. But his aim wouldn't hold. When the swarm crested the ridge, blinding panic would take over. It always did. You just held the trigger and screamed until the rifle clicked empty or a scythe limb took your head off. I don't want to die here, Cole. Miller whispered, his eyes wide and feverish behind a mud-splattered visor. I have a daughter in the core worlds. She's turning 6. Cole closed his eyes. He didn't want to hear about the kid. Hearing about the kid made Miller a person, and in 20 minutes, Miller was going to be meat. Nobody dies today, Cole lied, his voice flat. The vibration in the ground shifted from a hum to a violent rattle. The loose dirt at the lip of the trench began to cascade down in tiny avalanches, dusting Cole's shoulders. The sulfur smell grew stronger, overpowering the stench of mud and sweat. It was the exhaust of the vaccine plasma mortars. Then came the sound. It wasn't a roar. It was a high-pitched metallic shrieking, like 1,000 rusty hinges swinging open at once. The sound of the Vexin Vanguard communicating. It scraped against the inside of Cole's skull, making his teeth ache. The horizon, previously hidden behind a curtain of gray smog, suddenly lit up with a sickly fluorescent green flash. Incoming! Radek bellowed, diving off his crate. Cole threw himself face first into the freezing mud, covering his neck with his hands. He tasted dirt and gun oil. The ground bucked. A shock wave ripped through the air, sucking the oxygen out of the trench for a split second. The explosion was deafening, a physical blow that rattled Cole's ribs against his lungs. Clods of hardened earth rained down, burying his legs. Before the ringing in his ears could even begin, a second flash illuminated the sky. Then a third. The bombardment had begun. The silence was dead, replaced by the chaotic, thundering rhythm of an execution. For 10 minutes, the world was nothing but noise, heat, and falling dirt. Cole kept his eyes shut tight, pressing his face so hard into the mud he could barely breathe. Every time a mortar struck, the trench groaned. Somewhere to his right, a man was screaming, a high, reedy sound that cut through the explosions. Cole couldn't tell if it was Miller. He didn't look. He just curled into a tighter ball, a pathetic, shivering knot of a man waiting for a random piece of shrapnel to end his misery. The stench of ozone was overpowering, now mixed with the sickeningly sweet smell of burning synthetic flesh. Suddenly, the bombardment stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a heavy, pregnant pause, ringing with tinnitus. Cole slowly pushed himself up onto his knees. His entire body ached. His uniform was soaked through heavy with mud and water. He looked down the trench. Radek was gone. The spot where the sergeant had been sitting was now a smoking crater, a jagged hole in the earth lined with fused glass. Miller was still there, curled in the fetal position, his hands clamped over his ears, sobbing uncontrollably. Up! Cole croaked, his voice cracking. He kicked Miller's boot. Get up, you idiot! They're coming! He stumbled to the fire step, hauling his rifle over the edge of the parapet. He wiped a smear of mud from his visor and peered through the smoke. The razor wire laid out 50 yards ahead had been obliterated. And pouring through the gaps, emerging from the fog of war, like nightmares crawling out of a grave, were the Vexin. They were hideous. Standing 8 feet tall, their bodies were a chaotic fusion of organic chitin and jagged cybernetics. Multi-jointed legs stabbed into the ground, propelling them forward with terrifying jerky speed. Their mandibles clicked and slavered, and their 4 primary arms clutched crude but devastating plasma spitters. There were hundreds of them, a tidal wave of clicking, hissing violence rolling over the charred earth. Fire! Someone down the line screamed. Cole didn't aim. He just pulled the rifle tight against his shoulder, closed one eye, and squeezed the trigger. The kinetic rifle barked, bucking hard against his bruised collarbone. Tracers lit up the gloom, a desperate, disorganized volley from the surviving militia. He saw a Vexen take a slug to the chest. The creature staggered Ikor, spraying from the wound in a thick fluorescent arc, but it didn't stop. It just shrieked and charged faster. Panic, cold, and absolute gripped Cole's chest. His breathing turned rapid and shallow. He was hyperventilating. His finger locked on the trigger, spraying rounds wildly into the mass until the rifle gave a dull, empty click. "Reloading," he screamed, though no one was listening. He dropped back down into the trench, fumbling for a fresh battery pack. His hands were shaking so badly, he dropped it in the mud. "God, no, please, no," he muttered, digging into the sludge, his fingers slipping blindly against the plastic casing. Above him, the shrieking grew louder. A shadow fell over the trench. Cole looked up. A Vexen stood on the parapet. Up close, the smell of it was nauseating, like rotting meat and burnt plastic. Its multiple black soulless eyes locked onto Cole. The mandibles parted, dripping thick saliva onto Cole's armor. It raised a scythed limb. Cole didn't reach for his sidearm. He didn't try to roll away. He just froze, paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming inevitability of it. He felt a pathetic whimper escape his throat. So, this is it, he thought. In the mud, like an insect. A deafening crack split the air. The Vexen's head exploded. Not a neat hole, the entire upper half of its torso simply vaporized in a shower of blue blood and shattered chitin. The headless corpse stood for a second, twitching, before collapsing forward, its heavy bulk pinning Cole's legs to the trench floor. Cole gasped, choking on the stench of the dead alien struggling to push the heavy carcass off. "Hold the line!" a voice boomed over the tactical net. It wasn't Radek. It wasn't local comms. The voice was deep, distorted by heavy encryption, and entirely calm. Cole managed to shove the dead Vexen aside, scraping his shins raw. He scrambled back up to the fire step, grabbing his reloaded rifle. The sky above the battlefield was changing. The thick gray smog that had choked Oakhaven for weeks was being violently torn apart. It started as a low rumble deeper than the Vexen artillery. It was a frequency that rattled the fillings in Cole's teeth and made the puddle at his feet vibrate furiously. He looked up. Atmospheric entry streaks. Dozens of them. Brilliant searing lines of red-hot fire slicing through the cloud cover. "Council fleet!" Miller gasped suddenly beside him, his eyes wide with a desperate, fragile hope. Cole squinted, the rain lashing against his visor. "No," he breathed. Council dropships were elegant, teardrop-shaped vessels that descended on repulsor lifts, graceful and silent. These were not graceful. These were crude, brutal aerodynamic bricks hurtling toward the surface at terminal velocity. They weren't braking. The sonic booms hit a second later. A rolling thunderclap that knocked Cole backward, blowing out the audio dampeners in his helmet. The sheer concussive force of the sound staggered the Vexen charge. The shrieking swarm paused, their insectoid heads snapping upward in confusion. The pod slammed into the earth. They didn't land behind the trench line. They didn't land in a secure staging area. They crashed directly into the heart of the Vexen swarm. The impacts were catastrophic. Plumes of dirt rock and pulverized alien bodies erupted 50 feet into the air. The ground shook with a violence that made the earlier artillery barrage feel like a gentle tremor. Cole shielded his eyes from the flying debris, coughing as a thick cloud of dust washed over the trench. When the dust began to settle, Cole peered over the edge. In the center of the vaccine advance, a dozen massive craters smoked in the rain. At the bottom of each crater sat a heavy angular drop pod, the metal glowing dull orange from the heat of atmospheric entry. For a second, everything was perfectly still. The vaccine seemed paralyzed, unsure of what had just fallen from the sky. Then the explosive bolts on the pod doors blew. The heavy steel ramp slammed into the mud with a sound like a tolling bell. Steam hissed from the cooling vents, obscuring the interiors of the pods. From within the thick white fog, heavy mechanical footfalls began to echo. Thud, thud, thud. Cole held his breath. A figure stepped out of the steam. It was massive, easily standing 7 feet tall, in thick, brutally functional power armor. There was no sleek design, no shining chrome. The armor was matte black and heavily scuffed, scarred with blast marks and deep gouges from 100 other battles. On the shoulder, pauldron barely visible through the grime, was a faded emblem. A blue globe cracked down the middle. "Earth," Miller whispered, his voice trembling. "It's the Terran Marines." Cole stared. Humanity was a wild card. The Terran Alliance wasn't part of the Galactic Council. They were considered too aggressive, too volatile, a young species that solved its problems with overwhelming kinetic force rather than diplomacy. They hadn't answered a distress call in this sector in a decade. The lead Marine stepped fully into the rain. The helmet was a faceless slab of heavy armor, save for a narrow horizontal slit, glowing with a harsh crimson optic light. The vaccine, recovering from their shock, let out a collective ear-splitting shriek and surged toward the interlopers. The Marine didn't retreat. He didn't seek cover. He simply reached over his shoulder and unslung a weapon that looked more like a piece of industrial mining equipment than a rifle. It was an autocannon, a heavy rotary barrel monstrosity fed by a thick ammunition belt connected to a massive backpack. The Marine planted his boots deep in the mud, braced the weapon against his hip, and spun up the barrels. The sound was a terrifying continuous roar, the fabric of reality tearing apart. A solid line of depleted uranium shells ripped into the Vexen swarm. The impact wasn't like the neat searing burn of plasma. It was brutal kinetic devastation. Vaccine bodies simply exploded. Chitin shattered limbs were severed, and torsos were pulped into fine mist. The sheer kinetic force of the rounds threw the massive aliens backward, crushing those behind them. More Marines poured from the pods, dozens of them moving with ruthless mechanical efficiency. There was no shouting, no hesitation, just the rhythmic, deafening thunder of heavy ordnance. Cole watched, mesmerized by the violence. It was completely devoid of elegance. It was a slaughter. One Marine armed with a heavy flamer stepped forward. A stream of blinding liquid fire erupted from the nozzle, washing over a cluster of Vexen. The aliens shrieked, their organic components cooking instantly, the smell of burning meat turning Cole's stomach. The Marine just kept walking forward methodically, sweeping the fire back and forth, turning the mud into a scorched, glassy runway. To Cole's left, a Vexen stalker, a smaller, faster variant, leapt over the wall of fire, landing directly in front of a Marine. The alien lashed out with its scythe, sparking heavily against the Marine's chest plate. The armor held. The Marine didn't even flinch. He dropped his rifle, letting it hang by its tactical sling, and grabbed the Vexen by its throat. The servos in the Marine's gauntlet whined in protest. With a sickening crunch, he crushed the creature's windpipe, then casually tossed the twitching body aside like a piece of trash. He drew a heavy serrated combat knife from his thigh sheath and buried it to the hilt in the skull of another advancing alien. Cole couldn't look away. He was terrified of the vaccine, but looking at the humans, he felt a primal, deep-seated dread. There was no grace in how they fought. It was industrial. It was the application of maximum violence to achieve a singular objective. "Push up," the distorted voice boomed over the comms again. The Marines began to advance a slow, unstoppable wall of lead and fire, walking directly into the teeth of the swarm. They didn't bother using the trenches. They just marched over the open ground, their heavy boots crushing the bodies of the fallen vaccine into the mud. "What are you waiting for, militiaman?" A voice crackled in Cole's earpiece. Cole jumped. He looked up. A Terran Marine was standing at the edge of the trench, looking down at him. Up close, the armor was incredibly intimidating. The crimson optic strip stared at Cole unblinking. The Marine's chest plate was covered in alien blood and gore. Cole stuttered, his throat dry. "We were ordered to hold the trench." The Marine reached down, extending a massive armored hand. The servos hummed. "The trench is for dying," the Marine said, his voice a low, mechanical growl. "We're here to kill. Get up." Cole looked at the hand. He looked at his own trembling, mud-caked fingers. He didn't feel heroic. His stomach was still doing flips, and he wanted nothing more than to curl back into his hole. But the sheer gravitational pull of the Marine's presence was impossible to resist. He reached up and grabbed the gauntlet. The Marine hoisted him out of the trench with effortless strength, setting him on his feet. Cole swayed his legs, feeling like jelly. "Stay behind the armor," the Marine ordered, already turning away. "Shoot what moves." Cole racked the bolt of his rifle. For the first time in 3 weeks, he didn't feel like prey. The fear was still there, cold and sharp in his chest, but it was being replaced by something else. The raw, infectious adrenaline of the Earth forces. He looked at Miller, who had finally stopped crying and was pulling himself out of the mud, a dazed look on his face. "Come on," Cole said, his voice finding a fraction of steadiness. "Let's go." They fell into line behind the hulking shapes of the Terran Marines, stepping over the shattered remains of the enemy. The air was thick with smoke-falling ash and the deafening roar of human artillery. The Galactic Council had abandoned them to die in the mud, but humanity had come, and they had brought hell with them. Walking behind the Terran Marines was like following a controlled avalanche. The heat radiating off their power armor was intense, a baking dry warmth that cut through the freezing rain and made the sweat pool uncomfortably beneath Cole's synthetic undersuit. The air in their wake tasted of burnt ozone, spent propellant, and the sickeningly sweet, rancid tang of vaporized Vexin ichor. Cole didn't look at the horizon. He kept his eyes locked on the broad, heavily armored back of the Marine directly in front of him. He stepped exactly where the giant stepped, placing his worn boots into the deep, crushed depressions the Marine left in the mud. The craters were filling with a mixture of brown rainwater and the glowing, viscous blue blood of the dead swarm. Every step Cole took made a wet, sucking sound. He gripped his kinetic rifle so hard his knuckles ached, but he hadn't fired a shot since leaving the trench. There was nothing left to shoot. The Marines were a thresher moving with a mechanical, sweeping rhythm that left nothing alive in a 50-yard radius. When a Vexin drone burst from the mud mandibles snapping, it didn't even get a chance to shriek before a 3-round burst of depleted uranium tore it into wet confetti. God, Miller wheezed from somewhere to Cole's right. His voice was thin, ragged. They're walking through them, Cole glanced over. Miller looked awful. His visor was pushed up, revealing a face smeared with ash and pale as a corpse. He was limping, favoring his left leg and dragging his rifle by the sling. He looked like a man sleepwalking through a slaughterhouse. Cole wanted to tell him to keep his weapon up. He wanted to sound like Sergeant Radek, to bark an order and snap the man back to reality. Instead, he just swallowed the sour, acidic bile rising in his throat. "Just stay behind the armor," Cole muttered, repeating the Marine's order like a prayer. "Don't stop moving." The ground began to incline. They were approaching Ridge 114, the elevated position where the vaccine had set up their heavy plasma batteries. The terrain here was completely alien, terraformed by the bombardment. Blackened, petrified tree stumps pointed at the sky like charred fingers. The mud gave way to jagged fused glass, where orbital strikes had melted the topsoil days ago. The shrieking of the vaccine grew louder, shifting in pitch. It was no longer the disorganized screaming of an advancing swarm. It was a localized, frantic distress call. The Marine in front of Cole suddenly stopped. The abrupt halt caused Cole to bump hard against the massive armored shoulder pad. It was like walking into a concrete pillar. The servos in the Marine's suit whined as he dropped to one knee, bringing his heavy autocannon up. "Contact front. Heavy emplacement." The distorted voice crackled over the open frequency. Before Cole could process the words, the crest of the ridge exploded in blinding, searing green light. A vaccine plasma mortar had fired point blank. The projectile, a sphere of superheated magnetic-contained gas, didn't hit the ground. It hit the Marine standing 3 yards to Cole's left. The impact was deafening, but it lacked the concussive punch of human artillery. Instead, there was a horrific pressurized hiss. The Marine was thrown backward off his feet, a 2-ton heavily armored giant tossed like a rag doll. He slammed into the mud, sliding 10 feet before coming to a halt. The entire left side of his torso plate was glowing cherry red, the metal bubbling and sagging under the impossible heat. Cole froze. The breath left his lungs in a sharp gasp. For the last 20 minutes, he had convinced himself these Terrans were invincible. They were machines devoid of pain or vulnerability. But as Cole watched the downed Marine began to thrash, a horrific wet screaming leaked through the comms channel, tearing right through the heavy encryption. It was the sound of a human being boiling alive inside a steel cage. "Suppressing!" another Marine roared, stepping directly in front of the wounded man. The line erupted into deafening violence. Tracers crossed the blackened sky in solid, blinding streams, tearing into the ridge. The Vexin returned fire, the air instantly filling with the crackle of green plasma and the terrifying zip of kinetic shrapnel. "Corpsmen!" a voice barked. Cole couldn't move. His legs were locked. The smell of the plasma burn hit him, a localized wave of searing heat, carrying the undeniable, horrific stench of cooking meat. It bypassed the filters in his helmet, coating the back of his tongue. He doubled over, finally losing the war with his stomach. He threw up a meager, acidic splash of oats and bile onto his own boots, choking on the sour taste. "Hey, militiaman!" A heavy hand grabbed the back of Cole's tactical vest, hoisting him upright with bone-jarring force. It was the Marine he had been following. The crimson eye slit bored into him. "Grab his left arm!" the Marine yelled over the roar of the autocannons. He pointed to the thrashing, burning casualty in the mud. "Drag him back behind the defilade, move!" Cole's brain screamed at him to run the other way back to the cold, miserable safety of the trench. But his body, running on some raw, primitive autopilot, lurched forward. He grabbed the downed Marine's wrist. The armor was scorching hot even through Cole's heavy kinetic gloves. He could feel the heat blistering his palms. "Pull!" the other Marine grunted, grabbing the wounded man's chest rig. Together they dragged the massive, screaming casualty backward, sliding him through the mud and alien blood, hauling him behind the shattered remains of a concrete bunker. Plasma fire scorched the air exactly where they had been standing seconds before, turning the mud to glass. Cole collapsed against the concrete, gasping for air, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at his hands. His gloves were smoking the synthetic leather, partially melted. He had just saved a giant, and he realized with a cold spike of dread that the giants could bleed. The noise behind the concrete defilade was a claustrophobic nightmare. Kinetic rounds hammered against the other side of the wall, showering Cole in fine gray dust. The ground trembled endlessly under the weight of the Terran advance, pushing past them, a slow grinding machine trying to chew its way up the ridge. Beside Cole, the wounded Marine had stopped thrashing. The wet, agonizing screams had faded into a ragged, wet gurgle. The second Marine, the one who had pulled Cole by the vest, dropped to his knees next to his fallen comrade. Up close, Cole could see the intricate, brutal details of the armor. It wasn't just metal. It was a complex lattice of hydraulic lines, carbon fiber muscle fibers, and thick ablative plating, all of it currently covered in a thick layer of filth. "Hold him steady," the Marine barked at Cole. Cole scrambled forward on his hands and knees, the mud soaking through his trousers. He pinned the wounded man's massive right arm to the ground, using his entire body weight. The standing Marine reached down to the casualty's collar. There was a sharp hiss of escaping pressure, followed by a series of heavy metallic clanks. He was disengaging the helmet seals. With a brutal yank, the Marine pulled the heavy matte black helmet off. Cole stared. He didn't know what he had expected. A cyborg, maybe. A genetically modified freak of nature, bred in a test tube on some distant sterile orbital station. But it was just a man. He looked no older than 25. His hair was closely cropped, slicked to his forehead, with sweat and blood. His skin was pale, smeared with grease, and his jaw was locked in a rictus of unimaginable pain. A deep, jagged piece of shrapnel from the armor's inner lining had bypassed the neck seal and buried itself in his collarbone. Blood bright red, distinctly human blood, was pulsing out in thick, rhythmic spurts, mixing with the dark hydraulic fluid leaking from the suit's neck ring. "Hayes, look at me, Hayes," the standing Marine said. He ripped his own helmet off, tossing it into the mud. He was older, maybe 40, with deep lines carved into his face and a thick, jagged scar running through his left eyebrow. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they held absolutely no panic, just a grim, tired focus. "Artery is nicked, Barrett," the young Marine. Hayes gasped. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. "Armor. Heat breached the internal layer. I'm cooking, man." "You're not cooking, you idiot," Barrett growled, his hands moving with rapid, practiced efficiency. He reached into a thigh pouch and pulled out a fist-sized tube of biofoam. "It's just a graze." "It went straight through the ceramic layer." Hayes wheezed, his eyes rolling back slightly. My legs are numb." "Shock. Breathe through it." Barrett jammed the nozzle of the foam tube into the gap between the ruined chest plate and Hayes's neck. He squeezed. The foam expanded instantly, a thick white chemical compound that smelled sharply of bleach and iodine. It filled the wound, expanding and hardening in seconds, sealing the artery and gluing the shredded flesh together. Hayes let out a muffled scream, his back arching off the ground. He threw Cole off his arm like he weighed nothing. Cole scrambled backward, hitting his head against the concrete wall. He watched wide-eyed as Barrett physically pinned Hayes back down, putting a heavy knee into the center of the unbroken chest plate. "Stay down," Barrett roared. "Let it set." Cole's hands were shaking so violently he couldn't feel his fingers. He looked at Barrett. The older Marine's face was covered in a mist of Hayes's blood. It was in his graying beard smeared across his scarred cheek. They weren't gods. They weren't machines. They were just men wrapped in industrial steel, fighting a war that was entirely too big, with weapons that were entirely too loud. "Hey!" Barrett snapped, his pale eyes snapping to Cole. Cole flinched. "Yes. Your weapon, militiaman. Where is it?" Cole looked down. His hands were empty. He had dropped his kinetic rifle in the mud when he threw up. It was lying 10 feet away, currently being buried by falling ash. I dropped it," Cole whispered, a deep wave of shame washing over him. Barrett didn't yell. He didn't insult him. He just stared at Cole for a long, heavy second. Then he reached down to his own tactical belt and unclipped a heavy boxy sidearm. It was a large caliber slug thrower, ugly and devoid of any ergonomic grace. He tossed it. The heavy gun hit Cole's chest, slipping down into his lap. "Wipe the dirt off the slide," Barrett said, turning his attention back to Hayes. "We hold this defilade until the armor pushes over the ridge. If a bug comes around that corner, you put a hole in its face." "Understood." Cole looked down at the gun. It was heavy, the grip taped with coarse synthetic fabric. It smelled like gun oil and sweat. He picked it up. He wiped his thumb over the slide, clearing away a smear of gray mud. "Understood," Barrett repeated louder this time. "Understood," Cole croaked. He racked the slide. The metallic clack was loud, heavy, and satisfying. Above them, the shrieking of the Vexen reached a fever pitch. A massive shadow eclipsed the green flashes of plasma fire. Cole looked up over the concrete edge. A Vexene siege beast had crested the ridge. It was the size of a habitation block, a walking nightmare of heavily armored chitin and massive underslung plasma cannons. Its multi-jointed legs crushed the charred stumps into splinters as it began to descend toward the Terran line. Barrett didn't look up. He was busy locking Hayes's damaged armor joints, effectively turning the suit into a rigid splint. "Big one coming over the top," Cole said, his voice surprisingly steady. Barrett wiped a streak of blood from his forehead with the back of his gauntlet. He finally looked up at the towering monstrosity raining green fire down on his squad. A slow, tired sigh escaped Barrett's lips. It was the sigh of a man who was asked to work a double shift on a Friday. "Yeah, I see it," Barrett grunted. He reached down and picked up his autocannon, slinging the heavy strap over his shoulder. He looked at Cole, the exhaustion in his eyes briefly giving way to a grim, dangerous spark. "Cover the kid." Barrett stepped out from behind the concrete, planting his boots in the ash, and spun up the barrels. The autocannon roared a continuous deafening tear in the fabric of the atmosphere. Barrett didn't move a muscle. He stood completely exposed in the ankle-deep sludge, bracing the massive weapon against his hip as he poured a solid stream of depleted uranium into the advancing siege beast. The shells traced a bright sparking line across the gloom, hammering into the creature's central thorax. It didn't care. The rounds, which had effortlessly pulped the smaller Vexene infantry, sparked and ricocheted off the beast's thick, ablative chitin. It sounded like an industrial hammer striking an empty shipping container. Huge chunks of armor cracked and splintered, flying off into the rain, but the monstrosity barely slowed. It raised one of its massive trunk-like forelimbs. The plasma cannon underslung beneath the joint began to glow with a sickly building luminescence. The air around it warped with the intense heat. "Down!" Barrett roared, though the word was swallowed by the noise of his own gun. He threw himself backward into the mud just as the beast fired. The plasma bolt wasn't a projectile. It was a tidal wave of superheated gas. It struck the ground 30 feet in front of the defilade. The impact vaporized the standing water, instantly creating a concussive shockwave of boiling steam. Cole tucked his knees to his chest and pressed his face into Hayes's immobilized armor. The heat washed over the concrete barrier, searing the back of Cole's neck, singeing the tiny hairs on his arms. The smell of cooking mud and ozone was so thick, he gagged his lungs, burning with every desperate breath. When he opened his eyes, the world was obscured by a thick white fog of steam. "Barrett!" Cole choked out. He coughed a dry, rattling sound. "Barrett?" No answer. Just the heavy rhythmic thud of the siege beast's footsteps getting closer. The ground shook so violently, Cole's teeth clattered together. Hayes let out a low, wet moan. His face was pale, his eyes rolling lazily behind half-closed lids. The biofoam had hardened into a rigid, bloody collar around his neck, but his breathing was shallow and erratic. "Stay with me, kid," Cole whispered, panic tightening his throat like a vice. He didn't even know why he said it. He was a hydroponics engineer. He knew how to balance the pH levels of synthetic soil, not how to keep a bleeding giant alive. A shadow moved in the steam to Cole's right. It was fast. Too fast to be the siege beast, and too quiet to be a Marine in power armor. Cole froze. He gripped the heavy slug thrower Barrett had given him, his palms slick with sweat and rain. The weapon felt absurdly large in his hands, its coarse grip biting into his blistered skin. Through the dissipating fog, a Vexen stalker crept over the edge of a bomb crater. It was a hunter-killer variant. Leaner than the vanguard infantry, with a mottled gray-brown exoskeleton that blended perfectly with the ash. It moved on 4 multi-jointed legs, completely silent, its twin scythe limbs folded tightly against its chest. Its mandibles twitched, tasting the air, tasting the blood. It saw them, the creature's multiple black eyes locked onto the wounded Marine. It didn't shriek. It just lowered its center of gravity and coiled its back legs like a spring. Cole's heart hammered against his ribs. The fear was absolute, a cold paralysis that turned his blood to ice water. He wanted to squeeze his eyes shut. He wanted to pretend he wasn't there. He was a coward. He knew he was a coward, and this was the moment he was going to die because of it. But then he looked at Hayes. The young man was completely defenseless, pinned to the earth by his own ruined armor, trusting a terrified farmer to keep him alive. Cole forced his arms up. The heavy pistol shook violently. He didn't aim down the sights. He didn't know how to properly align them anyway. He just pointed the massive square barrel at the center of the creature's mass and squeezed the trigger. The recoil was a physical assault. The gun barked with a concussive crack that made Cole's ears ring instantly. The slide slammed back, kicking the barrel violently upward. The sheer force of it wrenched Cole's wrist, sending a sharp tearing pain up his forearm. He missed. The heavy slug tore a chunk out of the concrete wall 3 feet to the left of the creature. The Vexen lunged. It covered the distance in a single terrifying leap, its scythes unfolding to pin Cole to the ground. Cole didn't think. He didn't aim. He just screamed a raw, ugly sound of pure terror and yanked the trigger again, and again, and again. Crack, crack, crack. The gun bucked wildly in his hand, threatening to tear itself free from his grip. At point-blank range, the massive caliber rounds found their mark. The first slug shattered the creature's front leg, spinning it mid-air. The second round caught it in the lower abdomen, blowing a fist-sized hole through its chitinous plating. The creature slammed into the mud directly on top of Cole, a heavy, flailing mass of sharp edges and frantic clicking. Cole shrieked, kicking wildly, throwing his free arm up to protect his face. The alien scythe scored a deep, burning line across his shoulder, tearing through his Kevlar vest like tissue paper. It thrashed, pouring glowing blue ichor all over Cole's chest and face. The smell was horrendous, a concentrated burst of ammonia and rotting cabbage. He shoved the barrel of the slug thrower directly against the creature's twitching thorax and pulled the trigger a final time. The muffled detonation blew the back of the Vexen completely open. The thrashing stopped. The creature went limp, its heavy dead weight pressing Cole deep into the cold mud. For a long second, Cole just lay there, trapped beneath the alien corpse, gasping for air. His ears were screaming with tinnitus. His wrist felt broken. His shoulder was burning. He shoved the heavy carcass off his chest with a desperate, frantic heave, scrambling backward until his back hit the concrete. He sat there shaking uncontrollably, staring at the smoking gun in his hand. He had killed it. He had actually killed it. The ground beneath him lurched violently. The siege beast was right on top of them. The steam finally cleared, revealing the colossal monster, standing less than 50 yards away, its massive plasma cannon, charging for a final obliterating shot. Cole didn't raise the pistol. There was no point. It was like aiming a pea shooter at a mountain. He looked at Hayes. The kid was out cold. Cole dropped his head back against the concrete and closed his eyes. At least I tried, he thought. Then the sky tore open. The noise didn't start as an explosion. It started as a physical pressure in the chest, a deep vibrating frequency that forced all the air out of Cole's lungs. He opened his eyes. A shadow passed over the trench line, blotting out the meager gray light of the choked sun. It moved too fast to be a dropship. It was a Terran close air support gunship, a flying brick of heavy armor, massive thrusters, and rotary cannons screaming through the atmosphere just 50 feet above the mud. It sounded like canvas ripping in half-magnified 10,000 times. The gunship unleashed its payload directly into the broad armored back of the siege beast. The impact was cataclysmic. There was no bright flash of plasma, no elegant beam of light. It was a purely kinetic nightmare. Hundreds of depleted uranium tankbuster rounds struck the beast in a fraction of a second. The massive creature didn't explode. It was simply pulverized. Its thick ablative armor shattered into a million jagged pieces, and its internal organic structure was instantly liquefied by the sheer concussive force of the impacts. The beast's legs buckled, snapping under its own collapsing weight, and the enormous bulk crashed into the earth, sending a tsunami of brown mud and blue blood washing over the defilade. The gunship pulled up into a steep banking climb, the backwash from its heavy thrusters flattening the remaining Vexen infantry for 100 yards in every direction. Cole sat frozen, plastered in a fresh layer of freezing sludge, his jaw hanging open. The battlefield fell strangely quiet, save for the dull, constant roar of distant artillery and the heavy rhythmic drumming of the rain. The immediate threat was dead. The ridge was a smoldering graveyard of alien flesh and cratered earth. "Clear the backblast, you moron!" a rough voice coughed. Cole jumped. Barrett hauled himself over the lip of a nearby crater. The Marine looked terrible. The matte black finish of his power armor was scorched a dull gray, blistered and warped by the near miss from the plasma cannon. His left shoulder pad was gone, torn away, completely revealing the complex sparking servos beneath. He was limping heavily, dragging his autocannon by the strap. He stopped at the concrete barrier, looking down at Cole, then at the dead Vexen stalker lying 3 feet away, its torso blown wide open. Barrett looked at the heavy slug thrower, still clutched in Cole's trembling hand. The older Marine spat a thick wad of blood and saliva into the mud. "Sloppy," he grunted, "but it counts." He stepped over the dead alien and dropped heavily to one knee beside Hayes. He tapped the rigid foam-covered chest plate. "Still breathing?" Barrett asked, not looking at Cole. I think so," Cole stammered. He holstered the heavy pistol, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his sprained wrist. "He passed out a minute ago." Barrett nodded slowly, his pale blue eyes scanning the biometric readouts on Hayes' wrist gauntlet. "Heart rate is low, but he's stable. Medevac dropship is incoming. They'll pull him out." Cole stared at the veteran Marine. He expected Barrett to be frantic or angry, or at least relieved that they had survived. But Barrett just looked tired, incomprehensibly deeply tired. There was no glory in his posture, no heroic satisfaction in slaying the monster. He looked like a blue-collar worker clocking out of a grueling 14-hour shift, knowing he had to do it all again tomorrow. "You guys," Cole started, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard. "How do you do this? How do you just walk into that?" Barrett didn't look up from his gauntlet. He adjusted a locking mechanism on Hayes' shoulder. "We don't have a choice," Barrett said, his voice a low, mechanical rumble. "The Council, they fight with words. They draw borders on a star map and hope the bugs respect the geometry. Earth knows better. You don't negotiate with a swarm. You crush it, or it eats you. So we send meat and iron until the bugs choke on it." He finally looked up, fixing Cole with that dead, pale stare. "It's not brave militiaman. It's just math. We have more bullets than they have bodies." Eventually, footsteps sloshed through the mud behind them. Cole turned. It was Miller. The man looked entirely broken. His rifle was gone. His helmet was gone. He was covered from head to toe in ash and mud, his eyes wide hollow and staring at nothing. He walked with a slight erratic shuffle, like a wind-up toy running out of tension. "Miller," Cole croaked, pushing himself up the concrete wall. Miller didn't seem to hear him. He stopped a few feet away, staring at the pulverized, smoking ruins of the siege beast. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He just stood there, swaying slightly in the rain. Cole realized with a sickening twist in his gut that Miller hadn't survived because he fought. He had survived because he got lucky. The Terran Marines had swept over the battlefield like a scythe, killing everything in their path, and Miller had just happened to be standing in the spaces between the blades. The low, oscillating hum of repulsor lifts cut through the rain. A Terran medevac ship, heavily armored and bristling with defensive turrets, descended through the cloud cover. It didn't land gently. It slammed into the mud 20 yards away, its heavy boarding ramp, dropping before the landing gear even locked in place. 4 medics clad in lighter white and red power armor sprinted down the ramp, carrying a heavy anti-grav stretcher. They didn't shout or ask for sit reps. They moved with the same brutal mechanical efficiency as the infantry. They reached Hayes, secured him to the stretcher, and began floating him back toward the ship in less than 30 seconds. Barrett stood up his knee joints, whining in protest. He watched them load his man into the ship. "Get your guy," Barrett said to Cole, nodding toward the catatonic Miller. "Ship has room for wounded." Cole hesitated. He looked back down the ridge toward the trench line they had abandoned. It was a sea of mud blood and shattered chitin. "What about the line?" Cole asked. Barrett racked the bolt of his autocannon. The heavy metallic clank sounded final. "The line is moving forward," Barrett said. He turned his back on the medevac ship and faced the dark smog-choked horizon where the shrieking of the swarm was already beginning to build again. "Keep up or stay out of the way." Cole watched the giant walk away, a solitary figure of battered black armor fading into the rain. Earth hadn't sent saviors. They had sent exterminators. And as Cole grabbed Miller by the arm, dragging the broken man toward the ramp of the medevac ship, he finally understood the difference. The heavy ramp of the medevac ship clamped shut with a hydraulic hiss, severing the outside world like a guillotine. Instantly, the deafening roar of the artillery and the endless shrieking chorus of the swarm were reduced to a dull, vibrating thrum in the floor plates. The sudden absence of the noise was physical. Cole felt his eardrums throb, protesting the sudden shift in pressure as the cabin's life support systems kicked on. It didn't smell like salvation inside the ship. It smelled like a slaughterhouse doused in industrial bleach. Cole slumped back against the vibrating bulkhead, his legs finally giving out. He slid down the cold, riveted metal until his armored boots hit the grated floor. Beside him, Miller was strapped tightly into a crash web, his eyes still wide and unseeing, staring a hole through the ceiling panels. Miller's chest rose and fell in quick, shallow spasms. Across the narrow bay, the Terran medics were already at work on Hayes. There was no bedside manner. There was no gentle reassurance. It was a frantic, blood-soaked pit stop. The white-armored medics moved with the cold, practiced urgency of mechanics working on a ruined engine block. They stripped away the charred, melted fragments of Hayes's power armor, using heavy rotary saws that threw bright sparks against the cabin walls. Cole watched mesmerized by the sheer volume of blood. It pooled on the grated floor, draining into a catch basin beneath the surgical table. Bright red, undeniably human blood. One of the medics, her face obscured by a surgical visor, plunged a thick gauge needle directly into Hayes's sternum. The young Marine arched violently off the table, a wet gasp escaping his blue lips before slamming back down, heart rate stabilizing. The medic barked her voice flat and synthesized through her helmet. "Clamp the femoral. We're losing pressure." Cole looked away. His stomach rolled, threatening to empty the non-existent contents it had left. He looked down at his own hands instead. They were coated in a thick, drying crust of gray mud and glowing blue Vexin ichor. His knuckles were raw, split open from slamming against the concrete defilade, and his right wrist throbbed with a hot, sharp pain every time the ship hit a pocket of turbulence. He felt the heavy weight of the slug thrower resting against his thigh. He pulled it from his improvised holster, resting it in his lap. The metal was cold. The grip was sticky with his own sweat and the alien's fluids. He didn't want to hold it. He wanted to drop it on the floor and pretend none of this had happened. He wanted to be back in the hydroponics bay, complaining about the broken water calibrators and the smell of the synthetic fertilizer. But the smell of the fertilizer had been replaced by the smell of cooked ozone and burning hair. Cole leaned his head back against the bulkhead and turned his face toward a small, reinforced plasteel viewport. The glass was thick and heavily scratched, but through it he could see the sky. They were climbing fast. The thick, sulfurous smog that had suffocated Oakhaven for 3 weeks was parting around the ship's heavy repulsor fields. And then Cole saw them. The drop pods weren't stopping. They were still falling, a relentless fiery rain of black iron slicing through the atmosphere. But they were just the vanguard. Below the cloud cover, massive atmospheric transport ships were descending. They were the size of skyscrapers, ugly blocky monoliths, covered in heavy armor plating and bristling with point defense turrets. They weren't graceful. They didn't glide. They brutally forced their way through the air, their massive thrusters turning the ground below into a sea of glass before they even touched down. Earth hadn't sent a rescue team. The Galactic Council sent surgical strike teams. They sent diplomats and heavily regulated peacekeeping forces that operated within strict, clean parameters. If the Council had come, they would have evacuated the civilians, ceded the territory to the Vexen, and called it a strategic withdrawal. Earth didn't do strategic withdrawals. Earth did exterminations. Cole watched as a massive armored column rolled out of the belly of one of the transports. Dozens of heavy siege tanks, their tracks chewing up the mud, their massive railguns already firing over the horizon. The sky was stitched with the bright, searing lines of human artillery, an endless barrage that dwarfed the Vexen's plasma mortars. Oakhaven wasn't a colony to them. It was an anvil, and the Terran Marines were the hammer. A heavy boot tapped Cole's foot. He looked up. One of the medics was standing over him. She was holding a damp, chemical-soaked rag. Her white armor was heavily stained with Hayes's blood. She tossed the rag into Cole's lap. "Wipe the acid off your face, militiaman," she said, her voice distorted, but undeniably exhausted. "Before it eats through your cheekbones." Cole picked up the rag. It smelled like pure ammonia. He scrubbed it across his face, wincing as the harsh chemicals burned the micro-abrasions on his skin. "How?" Cole started, his voice a dry rasp. He cleared his throat. "How long has Earth been fighting them?" The medic turned back toward the surgical table, checking a series of glowing monitors. "The bugs, 4 years. They hit a mining outpost in the Orion Spur. Ate 100,000 miners before the Alliance could mobilize." Cole lowered the rag. "The Council said the Vexen were a localized threat. They said they only expanded when provoked." The medic let out a short, humorless laugh. It sounded like static. "The Council is full of politicians who think you can reason with a locust swarm. A bug doesn't need provocation to eat. It just needs a mouth." She looked back down at Hayes. The young Marine was finally still, his breathing shallow, but steady beneath a thick layer of synthetic skin grafts. "We don't wait for them to expand anymore," she said quietly. "We hunt them, wherever they nest, wherever they feed. We burn the dirt until nothing grows back." Cole looked back out the window. The rolling blackened plains of his home were being systematically wiped off the map, replaced by a grid of human fire and iron. He realized Barrett was right. There was no glory here. It was just math. And humanity had brought the heavier calculus. The medevac touched down with a violent bone-rattling thud. The ramp dropped, letting in a rush of cold, freezing air. The rain was still falling, but the sulfur stench was gone, replaced by the overwhelming industrial reek of burning promethium fuel and scorched metal. Cole unbuckled his harness. His fingers were stiff, unresponsive. He reached over and slapped Miller's shoulder. The man flinched violently, his eyes darting around in blind panic before finally settling on Cole. "We're down," Cole said, his voice flat. "Get up." Miller didn't speak. He just unclipped his restraints with shaking hands and let Cole pull him to his feet. They walked down the ramp and stepped onto the ground. It wasn't mud anymore. The Terran engineers had already laid down hundreds of square yards of interlocking steel grates, turning a bombed-out crater into a rigid, perfectly flat landing zone. Forward Operating Base Alpha had been built in less than an hour. It was a staggering display of logistical violence. Prefabricated concrete bunkers were being dropped from low orbit, slamming into the Earth like meteors before heavy automated cranes dragged them into defensive lines. Hundreds of Marines out of their power armor were hauling crates of ammunition, welding barricades, and shouting over the roar of the landing ships. Nobody looked at Cole and Miller. They were ghosts. Remnants of a failed defense standing in the middle of a machine that had no use for them. "Civilians to the yellow tents," a passing supply sergeant barked, not even breaking his stride as he carried a crate of artillery shells that must have weighed 200 pounds. Cole guided Miller toward a massive illuminated dome tent near the rear of the FOB. The inside was warm, smelling of synthetic coffee and dry heat. Rows of cots were lined up with mathematical precision. Hundreds of surviving Oakhaven militiamen were already there, sitting in stunned silence, clutching mugs of water, staring at the floor. A human nurse, wearing a lightweight hazard suit, approached them. She took Miller gently by the arm. "Shock," she noted, looking at Miller's dilated pupils. "Come on, sweetheart, let's get you a blanket." She led Miller away. He didn't look back. Cole knew he would probably never see the man again. Miller was going back to the core worlds. He was going to see his daughter. "You injured?" another voice asked. Cole turned. A Terran medic was looking him up and down his eyes, pausing on the scorched, bloody ruin of Cole's shoulder armor. "I'm fine," Cole said. He wasn't, but the pain felt distant, a dull ache in the background of his mind. "Suit yourself. Ditch the weapon in the bin by the door." The medic pointed to a heavy plastic crate overflowing with battered kinetic rifles and empty power packs. "You're out of the war, farmer. Go get a hot meal." Cole looked at the bin. He looked at the heavy slug thrower in his right hand. It was ugly. The matte finish was scratched, the grip was sticky with blood, and the barrel smelled faintly of burnt powder and alien rot. It weighed too much. It belonged to a giant who was currently walking through hell, moving the line forward while the Galactic Council watched from their pristine, sterile monitors 1,000 light years away. "No," Cole said, quietly. The medic raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me, I said no." Cole repeated his voice, finding a hard, solid edge he didn't know he possessed. "I'm keeping it." The medic stared at him for a long moment. He looked at the blood on Cole's hands, the dead 1,000-yard stare in the hydroponics engineer's eyes. The medic gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. "Suit yourself," he muttered, turning away. Cole didn't go to the cots. He didn't go to the mess line. He walked back out of the tent into the freezing rain. He found a stack of empty ammunition crates near the edge of the LZ and sat down. The metal was cold against his bruised legs. He placed the heavy pistol in his lap. He pulled the ammonia-soaked rag from his pocket and began to wipe down the slide, carefully removing the mud and the blue ichor, revealing the scarred, dark metal underneath. He wasn't a soldier. He knew that. If he went back out there, he would die. He would freeze in the mud, or panic, or get crushed by something he couldn't even comprehend. But he also knew he couldn't go back to the dirt. He couldn't go back to balancing pH levels and growing synthetic oats, while men like Barrett bled out in the sludge to buy him another sunrise. The council had left them to be eaten. Earth had come not out of pity, but out of a shared vicious refusal to die. Cole wiped the barrel clean. He racked the slide. The heavy clack felt like a promise. Above him, the rain began to slow. The heavy choking clouds of sulfur and ash which had blanketed Oakhaven for nearly a month finally began to break apart, torn open by the sheer volume of Terran atmospheric traffic. For the first time in weeks, Cole saw the night sky. There were no stars. The heavens were entirely blacked out by the silhouettes of the Terran Alliance orbital fleet. Massive brutalist dreadnoughts floating like iron leviathans in the void. They blotted out the constellations, their heavy engines burning with a cold blue fire that cast long, unnatural shadows across the ruined landscape. They were terrifying. They were monsters of metal and nuclear fire, built by a species that had looked into the dark, saw the teeth waiting for them, and decided to grow sharper fangs. Cole looked down at the gun, then back up at the iron sky. He didn't feel heroic, but for the first time since the war began, he didn't feel like prey either. The galaxy was a slaughterhouse, but humanity had brought the butcher. And as the distant roar of Barrett's autocannon echoed faintly over the ridge, Cole slid the heavy pistol into his holster, stood up from the crate, and turned his face toward the fire. When the universe leaves you to the wolves, you don't pray for angels, you pray for the wolves' worst nightmare. If this gritty boots on the ground, look at Earth's heavy metal war machine got your adrenaline pumping, show your support. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss a drop. We rely on you to keep these HFY Sci-Fi stories coming. Share this with your crew and sound off in the comments. Would you hold the line with the Terran Marines? Stay safe out there in the void, and we'll see you in the next one.